Okay, our last speaker is Dan Kaiser. Dan needs no introduction.
So I'm going to talk about, today is phosphorus. We're going to end up with this in looking at and going through some of these other presentations. The interesting thing here is I don't know if there's going to be a lot here that you haven't already seen based on some of what has been shown, particularly with some of the data that John and then Andrew talked about. But I'll kind of talk about my spin on things because one of the challenges here being in Minnesota is the fact that we have a lot of differences in our soil types and some of the chemical properties, which does make it challenging to come up with a strategy for nutrient management because it isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. And if we look at overall philosophies, I mean, the thing I like to start off with is the fact that I really don't care how growers manage their phosphorus. As long as it's staying on the field, it's not leaving the field, there are some options out there, and it's really not for me to decide how growers should be managing things. But if we start looking at different growers, and if you look at a young farmer versus an older farmer that may have more of the ground paid for, my general opinion on how I would approach things does tend to be slightly different when it comes to what philosophy to use. And if you look at Minnesota, traditionally was in what we call the sufficiency approach, which if you look at the build and maintenance versus efficiency, really the difference between the two is the build and maintenance, we're targeting maximum yield or building to a point where we get a maximum yield, versus the sufficiency approach, which we're trying to maximize return on investment. So when I start thinking about the situations across the state and the situations that farmers are going through, I mean, it really have to really factor in a number of things before we start looking at what's the overall best strategy. But realizing the fact that there's a lot of pressure out there, particularly in situations where we can build soils to what we deem to be a critical soil test level, that a lot of growers are doing that. So that's kind of weighed on me a lot when I've started looking at going through our fertilizer guidelines and then trying to build in some flexibility to growers to talk about a few of these things and give them some of the information they need, some of the tools they need to go through and make some of these decisions if they're sitting with their consultant or whoever is helping them make their fertilizer management decisions. So in 2020, I updated the guidelines. I mean, really the only major change is I put a removal-based system in. And a lot of this was kind of some of the things that John talked about. If you look at Wisconsin or some of these other states, essentially to look at a critical level, to look at if I was going to suggest some sort of removal-based system, where would that be based on the current guidelines? Then talking about fertilizer and specifically just to where I would suggest keeping your soil test at, because that's really what a lot of this drawdown is based on. Essentially, it's trying to maintain a soil test that's around a point at which we should have at least some profitable return from a fertilizer application. If you look at our current sufficiency guidelines, we do still have our band recommendations. One of the things, though, that you will likely see in the next few years is that's going to start to go away. Because if we look at some of the data, Minnesota has been one of the, if we look at a lot of our neighboring states, has been a little bit of an outlier when it comes to guidelines, as we're still maintaining that overall band efficiency. And while I think there's some soils out there where you can get some of that efficiency, more and more with a lot of the data that we're seeing for some of our recent research data is that we're not seeing that consistently with phosphorus. I think with potassium, you look at band applications, particularly in these drier years, we see some benefit. But with phosphorus, we know there's a lot of flexibility. And most growers, I mean, unless they own their own banding equipment, they're not really looking at anything other than a broadcast application. The main differences on what that's forced me to do is to put in the updated P and K removal values. That's in both the corn and the soybean publication. And I'm going to talk about this because I thought after John talked that I'd at least have that to talk about. Then Andrew decided to talk about it, so I kind of lost some of that. But in general, there's some comments I have on that because I think that a lot of times when it comes to, if we start talking about overall economics, we get too much wrapped into that we have to be managing down to a specific pound, that there's especially with phosphorus, that there's a one perfect number to be managing to, which when we look at P and K as well, we see a lot of variability and flexibility in terms of what we can do, and close enough is generally a good target. So when it comes to economics, I mean, really, if we look at our current guidelines, if I look at the sufficiency and the maintenance systems I have, and they're really the only difference really is in that if you look at anything between about 10 to 20 part per million Bray phosphorus, and that's really kind of around that medium to high range is where I would generally recommend looking at or removal-based applications, if that's where you're going to look at it, because I'll show some of that data, but if we start looking at a lot of our data, when we've drawn down to roughly 20 to 25 part per million, is when we tend to start seeing a lot of these applications become more profitable. And I think John mentioned what a lot of the recommendations are what we call a hybrid system. So it's not a true build and maintenance system with a lot of the recommendations where we recommend sufficiency, which in many cases our sufficiency recommendations are more than what that crop is removing, which will likely result in some slow building of the fertilizer. It just isn't as aggressive as your traditional build and maintenance system. Because if anybody would ask, essentially, if we start looking at how much phosphorus it takes to build by 1 part per million the bray, I mean, on average, it's about 16 pounds per part per million, but that's going to vary from soil to soil. And if, again, the main question is really, and I'll talk about this, is whether or not we're losing by not maintaining high soil test values from the initial start. And that's really the key question. I've really, when it comes down to the idea of an optimum soil test, I've really drug my heels in terms of replacing that medium or that high with an optimum, mainly because we get back to that situation with that new farmer that might be renting most of their ground, which is really focused on trying to get the highest return on investment, versus you've got an older farmer. And it was interesting sitting at a meeting over the summer with a range in farmers where you have the older farmer talking about input makes yield. But then you have the younger farmer saying, well, I need to make money. So, I mean, how do you balance these two? So that's kind of where I've drugged my heels a little bit on the idea of an optimum, because I can make two arguments. If I've got owned ground, my optimum might be 15 to 25 around that targeted critical point, versus if I have a lot of rented ground, it might be 10 to 20 where I'm trying to really maximize return on investment. So, you know, again, it's not a situation where I want to recommend a one-size-fits-all strategy, because it's really going to be highly dependent on what the growers, their attitude towards risk is going to be. So that's kind of where I've stuck on that. And then if you look at Minnesota being the fact that we've got a lot of soils with high pH, you might not be able to build. I mean, that's a whole different scenario. So that's why when I first came in, I think there's some that thought I was going to completely get rid of the recommendations we had here in the state of Minnesota and go to something more similar to Iowa. And while I could make that argument for the lower tier of counties next to the border, I mean, you start getting farther north and it becomes a harder sell, just because some of these soils, there's a lot of phosphorus there, but it isn't in an available form. So it's not a situation where I would really recommend trying to build if it's a situation where that soil test is going to come crashing back down, because it takes a lot more to maintain at some of these high pH soils at a higher soil test level. So that's the main question, is to build or not to build. I mean, that's really it. I mean, when I start talking about a lot of the economics here, I mean, that's really the big question to growers, is really what's that overall value in terms of building to a high soil test. And that was one of the main arguments when I came in. I know George Ream-Giles Randall, I mean, there was a lot of pushback between the two in terms of whether or not Giles was talking about maintaining high soil tests, and George, coming from a lot of work out in Nebraska, was on that sufficiency side, which is more of a Western approach at trying to maximize productivity. So that is really the overall question that really, in my mind, needed to be addressed initially, is, you know, whether or not we needed to maintain high to make sure that we had maximum yield potential. And that was one of the key pieces. And I think if you look at one of the foundational projects we had through the AFREC program, was this long-term phosphorus program study, where we looked at that across the state of Minnesota, because that's always the challenge when you look at a lot of the data, is we can take a number of locations that vary in soil test values that are different fields, but if they're not the same field or they're not managed the same way, their overall yield potential can vary. So that's was one of the key questions that we had when we started talking about a lot of this thinking on terms of maintaining high, is if we had everything given equal in these fields, I mean, is a lot of this true? I mean, is there a inherently higher yield potential with a higher soil test? I mean, we know that essentially if you have a low versus a high, that you're going to have more yield, but the question then is, can I fertilize my way out of that low to get the same yield potential, or if I lost yield potential by not maintaining a high for an extended period of time? So we did this at 6 locations across the state of Minnesota. We had 2 years in corn, 1 year in soybean. I'm not going to show the soybean data actually, because it looks pretty much the same. And if you look at the data where we had phosphorus, which is this plus P treatment, given our current bray or these are current Bray categories, that given enough phosphorus was applied, we had the same inherent maximum yield potential for a low, fertilized accordingly, versus maintaining a high. So that was one of the things to kind of think about there, is that essentially we could still get the same yield potential by fertilization, and that we didn't need to essentially look at these large or these really rapid build applications to get to that high consistently to make sure that we're at maximum yield potential. But again, if you look at it without phosphorus, yes, we know that you're not going to raise as much corn with a low soil test versus a high soil test should you not apply phosphorus fertilizer. So do high soil tests out yield low soil tests when properly fertilized? I mean, really the answer to that is no, if you hold everything equal, just based on a lot of our data. So, I mean, a lot of the work, if you look at phosphorus, is, John talked about some of this, is looking at critical soil test levels. So what is the point at which we should be fertilizing our soils to if we want to look at getting near maximum or 100% yield potential? And that's one of the interesting things I find about critical soil test levels, is you get some differences in opinions in terms of what that number should be. Should we identify the point at which we're at 95% maximum yield if we're applying fertilizer? I mean, give it a point where we would expect a yield response to fertilizer, or should that critical soil test level be at 100% relative maximum yield? And, really, I think, again, it's kind of, you can make arguments one way or the other. But the interesting thing here is, if we look at just the range in values, is that there's a pretty significant range in soil test values when it comes to, if you look at 95% of maximum yield for some of our data sets versus 100%. You could almost get close to a 10 part per million range in the soil test values. So, I mean, if you look at it in terms of just that overall change in yield, it's kind of like nitrogen. You get to a certain point where it gets to be relatively flat, the curve, where if you're looking at changes per pound applied, we tend to see a much lower overall availability. The main challenge I've had here in Minnesota has been with soybeans. And John showed some of the data from Iowa. They see a pretty similar response between corn and soybeans. And I think if you look at closer to the border, in the southern part of Minnesota, I think you could make that argument. But the challenge in Minnesota, where I see a lot of our issues with high pH soils, is soybeans and iron chlorosis. And I think that does throw kind of a monkey wrench into the mix. And when I show some of the data, I don't always see the same probability of response for my very low and low soil test categories. And a lot of it has to do with that. I think if you're dealing with more acidic soils, I think you're about the same, and some of the numbers that John was showing, I think, are pretty accurate in terms of that overall probability of response if you look at corn versus soybean. But it does become more challenging just because of some of the carbonates presence and what can happen with some of those carbonates. And some of this can be cleaned up if we use the Olsen soil test, and that's why we recommend it. And there's been a bigger pressure when it comes to some of the north central region to adopt the Malick 3 test across a lot of our labs, because a lot of our labs it would be advantageous because it's a one extraction solution that can handle many nutrients. But we do have issues with it, and it can have some problems in some of our high pH soils. And I mean, that's really, I said, the challenge that I've had is what I've really weighed on me in the last 18 years is, can I justify making a wholesale change in terms of focusing on one area of the state when I know that we have a lot of variability out there in our soils, that not everything is the same. So this data is actually in the corn publication. I mean, a lot of what John showed, I mean, a lot of what we have follows the same pattern. And that's why I know one of the challenges and one of the criticisms on a lot of our state guidelines is the fact that we see big changes, or we can see big changes when you cross a border in terms of what's recommended for phosphorus. And that's where I think that, you look at some of our older guidelines, there's been somewhat of a disservice to a lot of the growers because we've really ignored some of these key pieces of information, the one being this expected time that, or this probability of response, or the probability that the phosphorus will increase yield at a given soil test. And also looking at other things like the expected yield without P fertilizer, because when it comes to a lot of the economics, I mean, it isn't like nitrogen where we get these nice response curves consistently field after field. I mean, when we look at phosphorus with economics, we have to look at things differently. And really, this is the key information I think we need in terms of making decisions. The critical level is interesting. The problem with the critical level, it's so highly dependent on the model that the person that's developing that is using. And that's where, I really look at a lot of the regional efforts in terms of identifying critical levels, and it's where I have some arguments against some of the things that are being done, because I've been sat in on meetings for 6 months where we've argued what model to use for that, where and I can generally go in and look at a piece of data and tell you where I would define the critical level just by eyeball, because it's pretty evident just based on the just the way the data looks. So that's one of the things looking at and why I've argued with some of this data as it becomes more available, that we need to be providing our data differently and focusing on some different things versus just being completely focused on critical level. So again, this is the data that I was hoping to show, but then Andrew showed some of it, just to look at what crop removal looks like. And I think looking at economics, to me, it's interesting, because I talked to some consultants I know, and it's interesting essentially where independent consultants, you talk to your growers and get a plan together, and then you look at the as-applied maps, and whether or not that plan was followed or not, or the dealer talked them into just a little bit higher rate, just based on some of these figures. The main thing when I look at a lot of this data, there's a lot of variability in this data, and especially with removal, and Andrew did a very good job talking about this, talking where a lot of the states, they use what we call the 75% confidence interval, which is kind of up near the higher end of that curve, to look at what the suggested removal rate would be just based on crop removal. But this is what the data looks like, and I've kind of gone the other route and have been looking at the median. But it's interesting looking at this data, even looking at the numbers we have right now with the 250 bushel per acre corn crop, with that range from that 25 to 75% confidence interval, we'd see a range of about 20 pounds P2O5 acre difference between that low and that high end, which is pretty substantial when it comes down to it. And it can be a pretty substantial increase in cost, depending on how you want to interpret that data. And when I look at a lot of this, looking at phosphorus, a lot of times close is good enough. And that's where, getting hung up on one specific number, I think there's probably a better number to use for a minimum, but overall, looking at some of these, I think we get to be worried about being too prescriptive about some of these applications. And when it comes down to it, for the most cases, it's having some out there is better than nothing in most cases, more often than not. So again, these numbers are there. In the soybean publication, those numbers are there. I'm be part of a group now where we'll be looking at developing it for the North Central region, and we'll probably have more crops in it for removal. Really though, when I look at the two that I would look at more removal-based system, corn and soybeans are kind of the main one. If we look at edibles, wheat, some of these other crops, we just don't always see that high of a response to phosphorus, where that overall return for a removal-based system doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Really looking at, especially corn, where we remove a lot of phosphorus, is really where, if we're looking at managing, it tends to be, to me, if I look at the data, it makes sense more to err towards managing for the corn side of it. And generally, we're going to see most of these other crops be at or near maximum yield. So strategies for high testing soils, I think that's really kind of the key here when it comes to a removal-based system. And if you're soil testing, we look at variable rate P, or if we look at precision ag, really the power there is to be able to identify areas where we can significantly cut, particularly if we get into issues or situations where we get high cost per unit P2O5, is really we're looking at trying to make money on that regard. Because if we're at or above the critical level, we know that if we're at above where we should expect to be at 100% maximum yield, we know that adding more phosphorus isn't necessarily, it's not going to get us more yield or a greater return on investment. So then the question then is, we start looking at these situations where we get fluctuations in price. A lot of times we look treating the soil like a bank, it's not a perfect analogy, but there's situations where we know if you have a higher soil test, you're much more buffered against potential yield loss, and you've got much greater options in terms of what you can do overall if you want to prioritize your nutrients, because that's really what I look at on a lot of these. If you have a soil test value, you should be able to, particularly with phosphorus, pretty easily prioritize where phosphorus should stack up with some of these other nutrients. We know that nitrogen's always going to be number one for corn. Sulfur has been kind of variable, and then P and K we're assessing with the soil test. And the thing that I'll say, particularly with the soil test, is that the phosphorus soil test, I have much greater confidence in terms of the results, in terms of what that data is giving me. So that's really the big thing on it. A lot of times you'll see phosphorus prioritized above some of these other nutrients when, say, potassium, I've got more questions in terms of the overall effectiveness of that soil test. So, it's one of those things, while I know, I've heard it for years, that we look at a lot of these soils, a lot of them started low in phosphorus, and it's meant a great deal in terms of increasing productivity. But we get into situations where we get some imbalance in terms of the cost of P compared to the value of the crop. It's a situation where if you've built up to that point, you've got some flexibility in terms of what you can do. So John showed this data, and I kind of like the data that he showed. He showed it with different price scenarios. And really, again, a lot of my data follows a lot along the lines of what we're seeing here. Essentially, if you look at the low to very low, it makes sense to fertilize there because you're always going to, even with a situation where you have higher input costs and lower crop value costs, you're generally going to see a positive return to those given nutrients. It's really that what's deemed, or what here in the Iowa, this is Iowa data, in the optimal range, or what would be in our medium to high range, where it becomes a little less clear, particularly with higher costs, just because we know in general with the removal-based system, of the way that Iowa defines it, is their optimum range is the range that's optimal for removal. And again, I can make the argument, somewhere at different ranges for different scenarios, but a lot of our data follows along the same lines. Essentially, we draw down to 20, we get below that, we tend to see a positive return, or at least a break even for that phosphorus application on a year-to-year basis. Soybeans, it's a different story. One of the options we do have in the state, though, is starter, and there's still some growers, particularly in the western part of the state, that do have starter. I mean, I'm seeing it less and less in other parts of the state, and if you look at a lot of my data, the starter data, I've been seeing less and less research studies on starter just because fewer questions from growers, because a lot of them have kind of gone away more for a broadcast application. But I have looked at this, and if you look at our recommended rates, you'll see recommendations for the high to very high class of like 10 to 15 pounds, and a lot of that just is factoring in a starter rate. Because in many cases, once we get close to that critical range, around 20 part per million Bray, that if you're going to get a response, that first 10 to 20 pounds is going to give you the majority of the crop response within those within most of those fields. However, I've looked at this and looked at combinations of starter and broadcast. Some of the work I did actually as a master's student down in Iowa was looking at low input strategies versus broadcast strategies. And what we found for low soil tests is that generally you're not going to be able to get away with that low input strategy. You're going to need some broadcast and starter. And if you look at our data, these are 3 rates of 1034L. The green is 2.5, the red is 5, and the blue is 7.5 gallons. So it's applying 10, 20, and 30 units P2O5. And if you look at our low soil tests and even the very lows that I'm not showing here, is that we never could get the same yield as we could with a broadcast application. So with starter, when we start looking at yield, a lot of the yield in starter, it's nothing magic. It's about the amount of nutrients you're applying on a given basis. And that's one of the things that I'm seeing more growers shift to some of these lower salt mixes. And I don't know if we start looking at some of those lower salt mixes, if you're going to see the same results, because it's really about the total pounds of nutrients applied. I get to the medium soil test, then 2.5, 5 gallon, I can get away with that just as starter alone versus broadcast. And the same thing with the high with that. So looking at it in terms of the overall need, it's all based on how short that crop is of phosphorus. And it doesn't matter how I'm applying it, band versus broadcast. It's really about total pounds applied and not based on the placement. If you look at the starter response, typically we see something like this regardless. This is actually yield, but if you look at, if I had starter response, you'd see with and without phosphorus an increasing early growth for both the broadcast and the starter. But in general, once you get into a situation where you put enough phosphorus on, really that starter effect tends to wane, and we don't tend to see any benefit in yield from that starter application. So that's one of the things, if you are using starter, I think it's a good option for those that want to cut back on some of the higher soil test areas. But if you get enough nutrients on, that's really the big thing, is to make sure you account for what's actually in the starter for the phosphorus application. I think that's one of the bigger mistakes, is just not accounting for the fact that there's any fertilizer there. So, there's some flexibility there, again, the medium to high. If you look at what we overall need, that first 10 to 20 pounds is likely going to be enough to get you maximum yield potential. So net return over rotations, I'm just going to talk about this quick. This is some of the data we were looking at over years. I think that's one of the things that with a lot of these studies, when we look at a single year study in a field, is we don't always catch what's that overall impact from repeated years of application, which answers more of that long-term versus short-term benefit of increasing or reducing fertilizer application rates. So I did this a number of years ago looking at phosphorus at basically a removal rate for 2-year corn soybean rotation, different rates of potassium and sulfur. I'm not going to talk about the potassium and sulfur. I'm mainly just going to focus on this upper line, which is phosphorus. I'm looking at negative returns at Rochester. Red Wing kind of variable returns. I'll talk about this though here because this is a situation where we're in a drawdown phase. So by the year, this would be years 5 and 6, that rotation, seeing a positive benefit from the phosphorus application. But like Rochester, essentially they're negative, or where we're losing money from phosphorus year after year. And then Becker and Lamberton, Becker seeing a pretty sizable return on investment, and then Lamberton seeing particularly years 4 and year 6. I mean, really the difference on these, if you looked at what was happening essentially, is we're starting to draw down our soil test to what I would deem more that critical level. So between that 15 to 20 part per million Bray range at some of these locations. So kind of provided some of the basis of what I was thinking in terms of where we should be and where we should be at if we're dealing with fertilizer, to try to make sure we're getting some sort of profitability out of that fertilizer application. Beyond that point, again, negative returns. Could we have cut our rates back significantly? I mean, I think it's probably what would have been a benefit there to look at reducing on overall costs. So what about economics? I've looked at this as well. We had some 10-year studies at a number of field locations across the state of Minnesota looking at, these are different blocks where we had corn soybean rotations, and that's what block 1 and 2 are. We had corn and soybeans every year of the study, and they just rotated back and forth. Lamberton, Morris, and St. Charles. Lamberton and Morris started off at much lower soil test values than the St. Charles location, but over time, if we look at where we ended up, we started at 20 part per million Bray at St. Charles. We ended up at around 10 by year 10 of the study. And if we look at the locations where we started off with lower soil tests, is situations where we were seeing much greater consistency for return to P. What I wanted to know, though, and that's one of the things, if you start looking at a lot of these, is, we talk, again, about a lot of these things in the short term, is that in the long term, do we see essentially where the soil tests, we look at less than removal-based rates, do we see the soil test drop to the point where we start needing to apply more as we progress farther into the rotation versus what we're applying initially as we're starting to just initially draw down these fields? So these are economic application rates for a 2-year rotation, so roughly an average about 50 part per million at Lamberton, which we look at years 1 through 6, and this should be years, this is the later, I think it's like 4 through 8. I overlapped a little bit with part of the study. But seeing pretty similar economic returns to P for those later years. Then Morris, if you look at averaging this value together, it's roughly about similar at around 60 to 70 pounds P2O5 for a 2-year spread. So that's less than what that crop is removing on an annual basis. And I see this pretty consistently across a number of my locations, is if we start looking at what it effectively takes to maintain soil test over time and what we need in terms of economics, it isn't necessarily what the two-year removal rate is going to be for that corn-soybean rotation. And this was all applied directly ahead of corn, and that's one of the things I've seen consistently in many of my studies, is that corn likes fresh applications of phosphorus. Soybean isn't quite as critical. There are situations with in soils that have very high pHs, pHs of close to 7.8 to 8 or higher with carbonates, is then we see essentially benefits from an every year application. But overall, in many of these neutral to acidic soils, we know that just applying ahead of corn, both the P and K tends to give a better return on investment versus application every year directly ahead of the beans. And it's one of the things I've seen consistently, that a 2-year spread can work for most cases. Again, the only situation that I've seen some instance of an issue is when we get into situations where we have a lot of carbonates in the soil. So what are the risks of cutting back? John showed some of this data. We know that over time, generally the Bray soil test, if we don't apply any phosphorus, the average is about 1 to 2, I think closer to 1 part per million drop a year. But realize the fact, and that's one of the things I think that's challenging, that if you're soil sampling every 4 years, it kind of depend on, if you look at all these numbers are bouncing around to the soil test over time, is that you might catch these instances where you might be on a high situation where it comes back higher than expected, or one that maybe has a a greater drop, but overall, I mean, when we start looking at it, the trend is more gradual than some of this variability from year to year. And it's interesting. Usually we get into these situations with these drops is when I start getting questions from consultants in terms of what's happening within the field. But if you have, samples over time, just look at your general progression or your general trends for soil test is really the best thing you can do. But realize the fact that you might get into some of these situations where you might get into a year where we see one of those larger drops. It's really particularly easy to see with potassium with dry weather conditions that we tend to see some of those larger decreases that come into play. And I've looked at these 10-year p-balances. I mean, really one of the questions I've tried to do over the last few years to try to look at what exactly do we need in terms of crop removal to maintain soil tests over time. And similar to where those economic rates are, if you look at the overall amount, if we targeted exact removal year after year, and in many cases we are actually increasing soil tests by about 1 to 2 part per million annually. So the balance in terms of hitting exact removal, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to maintain. It's more likely that you're going to increase soil tests over time. And if we look at essentially what we needed for percent of crop removal for maintenance is that we're ranging anywhere from about 1/3 to 2/3 of what that 2-year removal would be to maintain the soil test over time. So this goes back to my argument with when we start looking at the overall amount we need to be targeting for removal, that there's some variability in that data. And is that also the fact that when we start looking at that we can maintain with a number less than removal, is that we don't need to be as prescriptive in terms of the amount we're applying. We don't need to be tweaking these rates by 10, 15, 20 pounds just because yields were higher, because overall the general trends when we start looking at a lot of our data is that it doesn't necessarily that exact removal doesn't mean maintenance across a number of these fields. So just kind of wrapping up here, this is one of the things I think is challenging right now. I mean, what's a normal price for P? I wasn't around for Brian's talk, so I don't know exactly what all he talked about. But normally, if you look at a lot of our nutrients, so typically things tend to moderate around a 0.1 price ratio. DAP has been different. I mean, if we look at it the last few years, it's been a lot higher than that. And that's, I think, been the main challenge and why, we're talking about phosphorus here more than anything else, because the economics aren't necessarily as good as they've been historically. And a lot of that really has to do with the global demand of what fertilizers, specifically phosphates, are, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. But that's kind of the change, because if you look at many of these other nutrients, this is just of what I pulled up at the end of January, that most everything else is, roughly 0.1 to maybe 0.125. for price ratio, and DAP has been kind of the main question mark in terms of overall benefits. So if we're looking at it, looking at managing the high cost, it's really looking at using your soil test as much as you can. So if we're looking at critical levels, again, if you're above 20 part per million Bray, even especially above 25 part per million, we know that looking at a lot of the data is that we can hold our soil tests relatively well with a reduced rate or a percentage of crop removal. So maybe targeting 40, 50% of crop removal at that point in time. It's going to slow down the decrease. You're not going to get that 1 part per million drop, but, at least looking at it in terms of overall return on investment, it's kind of at a point at which where the majority of that, again, 10 to 20 pounds that first year applying is where you're going to get the majority of your response. Starter has been one of the interesting ones, and if you're looking at switching sources, really the thing I recommend to most growers to look at is how many nutrients you're buying. I like 1034. Personally, I know there's a lot of criticisms out there, particularly with the quality of the product. But in general, if you're looking at overall pounds of nutrient per ton, it's going to be the best source when it comes to liquids that's out there. And looking at some of these other things with additives, specifically things that are supposed to release phosphorus, I haven't seen any miracle products out there in terms of that. So that's one of the things you have to weigh is, look at how much nutrient you're applying if you're buying some of these other sources, because many of them have a much lower concentration of phosphate, so you're not getting as much benefit from that in terms of total pounds, because again, yield is about pounds of nutrients applied, not about overall placement based on a lot of our data. And really where I look at it, if I can't get around 10 pounds P2O5 economically with a starter, I just generally would forget the starter application and try to put that money, since you're paying more per unit pound for that 1034, I'll just put it into dry broadcast And especially if you're looking at cutting rate, I think it's a better option in the end. I mean, it may not look as good early in the season, but in the end, you're going to be better. So, where does the outlook look? I mean, I don't know really right now. If you look at, how much is coming into this country, specifically MAP and DAP, I mean, there's a significant part of our DAP that's imported. Traditionally, China's been a major exporter, but they've cut a lot of their exports of DAP. And that's been, I think, one of the major issues that's been resulting in the higher phosphate price. I mean, I'd like to see and look at whether or not triple could supplant some of this. I mean, I don't know. I mean, looking at it in terms of cost, I mean, it isn't necessarily an issue. I said we start looking at where we can easily correct it with increasing some of the production here. And I don't know exactly what we could supplant if we increase production here in the States. But if we look at it, a lot of what the MAP is produced here in the state, and a lot of the mines in the U.S., we look at it, are producing MAP here in the States. So, looking at it in terms of what's that overall outlook, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not really a good enough prognosticator in terms of knowing what that's going to look like, but there's just a lot of competition, particularly since the fact that phosphoric acid is used in other manufacturing. So there's just a lot more competition for some of the raw materials than we get with some of the other nutrient sources. So banding, again, represents a separate question that's likely going to go away. Sufficiency approach will give you a higher return on investment. The only issue with the sufficiency approach is you need to be soil testing more often. And that's one of the things, one of the old professors, Charles Shapiro, that was in Nebraska, asked me a few years ago about our sufficiency approach, because that's one of the things they're noticing, since they are also in the sufficiency approach, is that they're seeing a lot of their soil tests start to decline to points at which they're getting into that situation where there are a higher probability of response. So there's a question of how things were happening here, but I think a lot of our growers, being that they're more of a maintenance style, is that we're not quite in that situation where majority of our acres are getting to a point where they need fertilizer application. Uncertainty, and we know there is some there. That's why if I look at, I say 20 part per million, but honestly, if you're looking at maintaining anywhere from 15 to 25, and some of that just because, soil testing isn't perfect. Looking at how many grid cores you take and how you sample really can affect that overall question mark in terms of uncertainty, in terms of what the true soil test is within a grid. So a lot of times when you're looking at it, let's say a lot of growers that are looking at 15 to 25 part per million really are kind of what they're targeting, particularly a lot of their growers that own a lot of their acres. And a lot of that is because of the uncertainty with that. So sometimes you'll see that within that, and that's, we'll moderate some of these recommendations just from what we know from uncertainty with soil testing. And then crop response to P slows to around 20. John talked a little bit about where we hit at a point where we get into soluble phosphorus issues. Really with fertilizer, though, I don't think there's really any reason to be managing above 30 with that. Looking at it, really that's why I recommend once we hit that point to start reducing applications to drawing down, because, in effect, looking at it, we could look at quite a few years of phosphorus in those soils, which right now with high prices may not be the worst thing in the world, but overall looking at managing, it's a different scenario if we're talking about manure versus fertilizer, especially when you're buying that input annually and versus producing the manure on your own farm and being able to utilize it. What my opinions in terms of where we would recommend that critical soil test be. How accurate are your tests? Looking at it, it is interesting. Some of the data that Andrew was showing, we know there's a lot of phosphorus out there. Only a relatively small percentage is available. I see a greater percentage if you look at available P in our sandy soils versus our high pH soils. We see a higher total P in the high pH soils because a lot of that's calcium bound. But there is a lot out there. Really the thing on the soil test is the Bray and the Olson do tend to still work pretty well here for the state of Minnesota. So that's why I recommend them. Looking at them, they tend to be very good predictors in terms of what we're seeing crop responses annually. Source-wise, I have been getting more questions on triple. Really looking at a lot of our data, we don't see a lot of difference between triple, MAP, or DAP with it in terms of that overall effectiveness. Some think MAP is a better option for higher pH soils because if you look at the pH around when that granule starts to dissolve, MAP will acidify the area in the soil around the granule. Triple will do that as well. So, looking at the sources, We know there's some issues with solubility. We come into some problems where that, sometimes some of those granules can be a little more slow dissolving. But a lot of where I've seen that be more of an impact is when we've been into some of these drier years. And really in terms of, where my concern is, I'm least concerned about the source. I mean, I think there's a lot of flexibility that's out there. I mean, really the only thing that I would really concerned about slightly is the struvite. Andrew mentioned some of that because of the low solubility, and we've seen some issues in terms of availability.